Different between Intel i-series processor generation. Intel processor. Pentium 1234, Celeron Pentium Dual Core Core 2 Duo. Core 2 Quad Core i3 i5 i7 and i9. The concept of Intel processor generation mainly started. It comes after Core i-series released. First generation Intel processor, Nehalem architecture. Nehalem was the Intel processor first microarchitecture. It was released in November 2008, but in production or the first i3 Intel generation processor launched on January 2010. It is 45 nanometer technology architecture processor. Second generation Intel processor, Sandy Bridge architecture. Sandy Bridge microarchitecture was introduced in 2011. It is used 32 nanometer technology architecture processor. Third generation Intel processor, Ivy Bridge architecture. Ivy Bridge microarchitecture was introduced in September 2012. It is used 22 nanometer technology architecture processor. Fourth generation Intel processor, Haswell architecture. Haswell microarchitecture was released in 2013. It is used same as 22 nanometer technology processor. Fifth generation Intel processor, Broadwell architecture. Broadwell microarchitecture was released in September 2014. It is used 14 nanometer technology architecture processor. Sixth generation Intel processor, Skylake architecture. Skylake microarchitecture was released in August 2015. It is redesign of the same as 14 nanometer technology architecture processor as Broadwell line. Seventh generation Intel processor, Kaby Lake architecture. Kaby Lake microarchitecture was released in October 2016. It was 14 nanometer processor technology architecture. 8th generation Intel processor, Kaby Lake Refresh and Coffee Lake architecture. Coffee Lake microarchitecture was launched in October 2017 and also same year released Kaby Lake Refresh is the Intel 8th generation processor. It is used 14 nanometer technology architecture processor. 9th generation Intel processor, Coffee Lake Refresh architecture. Coffee Lake Refresh microarchitecture technology was released in 2018. It is 14 nanometer processor architecture. 10th generation Intel processor, Ice Lake architecture. Ice Lake microarchitecture was released in July 2020 for mobile processor, but no desktop processor have been released. It is 10 nanometer processor architecture. Interview questions with answers. Question 1. What do you mean by Intel generation? Answers. The term generation is applied to Intel processor to mean new significant development in processor architecture or function. Question 2. What is the latest Intel processor generation? Answers. 10th generation Intel Core i-series processor. Question 3. What is the size of latest Intel 10th generation processor? Answers. 10 nanometer. Question 4. How to know my processor generation? Answers. Go to Start menu, then Settings, then System, then About, then Next to Processor. You will see your processor and the first number after i3, i5, i7 and i9. Example, Intel Core i3, 6006U processor. It's mean it is Intel Core i3 6th generation processor. Question 5. What is the difference between Intel i3, i5 and i7 7th generation processor? Answers. It is Intel i3 7th generation processor. It has 2 physical cores with hyperthreading. i5 has 4 physical cores without hyperthreading. i7 has 4 physical cores with hyperthreading technology. All 7th generation processor using turbo boost technology. Question 6. How to identify any processor generation? Answers. You can also identify the generation of the processor if your processor is Intel Core processor. The generation of the processor is written by the first number after i3, i5, i7 and i9. Like example, Intel Core processor i9 10100 processor, it is 10 generation processor because the number 10 is written after i9. Question 7. What is the difference between first, second, and third generation Intel processor? Answers. The first generation Intel processor mean it was 45 nanometer technology processor. The second generation processor mean it was 32 nanometer technology processor. The third generation processor mean it was 22 nanometer technology processor. Question 8. Which is the better Intel i3 10th generation or i5 8th generation? Answers. Look at the base and maximum frequencies of the i3 10th generation is slightly better than i5 8th generation, but when we look at the core's performance and the number of threads, the i5 8th generation comes on the top. Question 9. Which generation of processor is the best for Intel? Answers. The Intel Core i3 is the base or entry-level processor, and Core i7 or i9 processor are more powerful, good performance, hyper-threaded quad-core processor. It is depending on your requirement what you purchased, or if you need a faster and more capable CPU, you want to buy a i7 or i9 processor, but if you buy a budget segment processor, so it is your best option to buy i3 processor. Question 10. What do you mean Intel i5 8th generation? Answers. It is Intel 8th generation series and it is Core i5 processor. Thank you. Please like and share this post and subscribe my YouTube channel.